The government called him dangerous. The town called him savage. Yet on the coldest night of February, a Lakota chief gave his most sacred gift not to his son, not to his people, but to a white schoolteacher who had already lost everything but her courage. The mission bell counted 7 when Clara Henley carried her medical satchel across the frozen yard to the trading post's back room. Chief Running Bear lay on a narrow cot, his breathing shallow as creek ice. She'd been coming here every night for 3 weeks, ever since the federal agent brought him in more dead than alive. "Water," the old chief whispered, his voice no stronger than wind through winter grass. Clara lifted the tin cup to his cracked lips. "Easy now, just a sip." The trading post creaked around them, empty save for dusty shelves and the smell of old leather. Through the single window she could see the lights of Millerville's Main Street, the saloon, the general store, the depot where the evening train would arrive in 2 hours. Everything orderly and white settled, while here, in this forgotten room, a Lakota chief fought death with nothing but her nursing and whatever prayers still lived in his fever dreams. She dipped the cloth in the wash-basin again. The water had gone tepid, but it was all she had. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose window-pane. February in Dakota Territory held no mercy for anyone, least of all a dying man whose people had been moved 300 miles south to the reservation. Running Bear's eyes opened, focusing on her face with difficulty. "Why?" he asked. Clara had wondered the same thing. When Agent Morrison had dumped the chief here like a sack of grain, claiming he was too sick to travel but too dangerous for the jail, every decent person in Millerville had found urgent business elsewhere. Only Clara, whose late husband had traded fairly with the Lakota before the Troubles, had volunteered to tend him. "Because someone should," she said simply. The chief's calloused hand closed around her wrist. His grip was weak, but insistent. "My name," he said. "When I die, you take my name." Clara stilled. In all her 28 years she'd never heard of such a thing. White folks didn't take Indian names, and Indians didn't give them away to strangers. But something in his eyes, not delirium, but clarity, made her nod. "I will." His hand released her, and his breathing deepened slightly. Through the window she could hear the distant whistle of the 8:15 train pulling into the depot, right on schedule. Life continuing, as it always did, while in this small room something impossible was taking shape. Clara adjusted the thin blanket around the chief's shoulders and settled into the wooden chair for another long night. The lamp flame danced against the glass chimney, steady and patient as her vigil. The next morning brought Agent Morrison to her boarding-house door at precisely 10 o'clock, his breath steaming in the cold air. Clara set down her coffee cup and stepped onto the porch, pulling her shawl tight. "Miss Henley, I have concerns about your ministrations to the prisoner." "He's not a prisoner. He's a dying man." Morrison adjusted his spectacles, a gesture she'd learned to recognize as his preparation for unpleasant business. "Nevertheless, certain parties in town feel your involvement island inappropriate. A white woman spending nights alone with a savage Chief Running Bear has more honor in his little finger than most Christian men have in their whole bodies." Clara's voice carried the frost of the morning air. "If you have concerns, Agent Morrison, perhaps you should have found him proper medical care instead of leaving him to die in a storage room." The agent's face reddened. "The territorial government has allocated exactly $12 for his care. Nothing more. $12. Clara thought of the medicines she'd bought with her own money, the food she'd prepared, the nights she'd sat awake watching his breathing. "Then $12 is what his life is worth to you." Morrison tipped his hat, but his smile held no warmth. "Good day, Miss Henley. Do remember that your teaching contract comes up for renewal in April." As he walked away, Clara felt the familiar weight of being a single woman in a territory where respectability mattered more than righteousness. But through her boarding-house window she could see the trading post where a man lay dying, alone except for her care. She picked up her medical bag. The trading post at midday felt like a chapel, quiet and still. Sunlight streamed through the window, showing dust motes dancing above the chief's bed. His fever had broken some time in the early hours, and now he slept peacefully for the first time since she'd known him, Clara sorted through her supplies willow bark tea, clean bandages, a precious vial of laudanum she'd saved from her husband's final illness. The chief stirred, his eyes opening to track the movement of her hands. "You are learning," he said, his voice stronger. "Learning what?" "To count cost before paying it." Clara paused in her work. "What do you mean?" "The agent threatens your position. Your neighbors whisper. Yet you come." He struggled to sit up slightly, and she helped him, noting how much steadier he seemed. "This is warrior thinking. I'm no warrior. I'm just a school teacher who can't stand to watch suffering." Running Bear's eyes held hers. "My grandmother was a healer among our people. She said the same thing." He reached under his pillow and withdrew a small beaded pouch. This was hers. "The medicines inside are nearly gone, but the knowledge remains." He pressed the pouch into her palm. The beadwork was intricate blue and white in patterns that seemed to shift like water. "Why give this to me?" "Because you understand that healing has no color." Clara felt the weight of the gift, heavier than its physical mass. Outside, she could hear the sounds of Millerville going about its business wagon wheels on frozen ground, the blacksmith's hammer, children playing during their noon recess. All of it familiar and safe and white. She tucked the pouch into her medical bag. That evening, as the sun set behind the grain elevator, Clara made her way to the trading post for what had become her regular vigil. But tonight felt different. Running Bear was sitting up in bed, alert and watchful. "Tomorrow I will be strong enough to travel," he said. Clara felt a strange mix of relief and loss. For 3 weeks, caring for him had given her days a purpose beyond the endless cycle of teaching children whose parents barely tolerated her presence. Back to the reservation? "If I choose to go—" Something in his tone made her look up from preparing his evening medicine. "You have a choice?" Running Bear smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "I have been thinking about names. Clara Henley, about what it means to give one away." The lamp flame flickered as a gust of wind rattled the building. Outside, the evening train whistled its approach to the depot, carrying whatever news and strangers this day would deposit in Millerville. "Among my people," the chief continued, "names carry power. They hold the essence of who we are, who we have been, who we might become. When I give you my name, I give you my place in the world." Clara set down the medicine cup, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't understand." "You will." The blizzard struck on the 4th Thursday of February, roaring out of the north with a fury that sent every soul in Millerville scrambling for shelter. Clara made it to the trading post just as the first heavy flakes began to fall, but by midnight the wind howled like a living thing and snow piled against the windows. Running Bear had grown stronger each day, but tonight the storm seemed to pull him back towards something ancient and wild. He sat by the window, wrapped in his blanket, watching the white chaos outside. "This is how the world began," he said. "In the time before time, when Grandmother Turtle dreamed the first storm." Clara added wood to the small stove, grateful for its warmth. "Tell me." For the next hour, as the blizzard raged outside, Running Bear spoke of creation stories and star patterns, of buffalo hunts and vision quests, of a world where every tree and stone and stream had a name and a spirit. Clara found herself leaning forward, drawn into a universe larger and older than anything she'd learned in her neat schoolhouse. "My Christian name is Joseph," he said finally. "The missionaries gave it to me when I was 7 years old," said Running Bear was heathen nonsense. "But names are not clothes to be changed for fashion. What does Running Bear mean?" "It was my grandfather's name, and his grandfather's before him. It means one who moves between worlds, the world of man and the world of spirits, the world of peace and the world of war. A bridge." Clara understood then why Agent Morrison feared him, why the government wanted him locked away on the reservation. A bridge between worlds was a dangerous thing to those who preferred their worlds separate and simple. The storm began to ease near dawn, and Clara realized something had shifted between them. Not romance, she was not such a fool, but recognition. Two people who had found themselves caring for something the world preferred to ignore. "When this storm ends," Running Bear said, "everything will change." Clara nodded, though she didn't yet know how right he was. The storm had left Millerville buried under 3 feet of snow, but by the following Monday the main streets were cleared and business resumed. Clara walked to school through the crisp morning air, noting how the townspeople's eyes followed her with new attention. Word had spread about her nights at the trading post, and not in her favour. At the schoolhouse she found a note pinned to her door. "Meeting of concerned parents, tonight, 7 o'clock. Your attendance required." Clara crumpled the paper and unlocked the door. Inside, her 23 students waited with the particular stillness that meant trouble. Young Tommy Morrison, the agent's son, raised his hand. "Miss Henley, my pa says you've been consorting with savages." The other children turned to stare at her, their faces reflecting their parents' whispered conversations. Clara set down her books and considered her words carefully. "I've been caring for a sick man, Tommy, as any Christian person should." "But he's not Christian," piped up Mary Carlson. "He's heathen." Clara looked at her students, German immigrants, Norwegian homesteaders, Irish railroad workers, children all learning to be American in her classroom. "What does it mean to be Christian?" she asked. The children exchanged glances. Finally, little Susan Harper raised her hand. "To follow Jesus? And what did Jesus do when he found sick people? Healed them," several voices chorused. "Did he ask what church they attended first?" Silence fell over the classroom. Clara opened her lesson book, but her mind was on the conversation awaiting her that evening, and on Running Bear, who grew stronger each day in his small room behind the trading post. That night, Clara arrived at the schoolhouse to find every chair filled with parents and townspeople. Agent Morrison sat in the front row, his wife beside him, both wearing expressions of righteous concern. Mayor Kellerman called the meeting to order. "Miss Henley, we appreciate your charitable impulses, but your behavior has become a source of concern for the community." Clara remained standing, her hands clasped before her. "What behavior?" "Spending nights alone with a male Indian prisoner." "Chief Running Bear is not a prisoner. He's a sick man who needed care." Mrs. Morrison spoke up, her voice sharp with disapproval. "It's unseemly, inappropriate. What example does it set for our children?" "The example of Christian charity." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mayor Kellerman held up his hand. "Miss Henley, we've decided pending the school board's review that your teaching contract will not be renewed." Clara felt the words like a physical blow. Teaching was her livelihood, her purpose, her place in this community. Without it, she would have to leave Millerville, find work somewhere else, start over again. But as she looked at the faces surrounding her people she'd taught their children to read, whose wounds she'd tended, whose harvests she'd helped celebrate, she thought of Running Bear's words about counting cost before paying it. "I understand," she said quietly. "Is there anything else?" The mayor looked surprised by her calm response. That's all." Clara walked home through the snow, her breath visible in the cold air. At her boarding house she packed her few belongings into a single trunk, then made her way to the trading post for what might be her final night of nursing. Running Bear was sitting up in bed, fully dressed in the clothes Agent Morrison had brought him, white man's clothes that hung awkwardly on his frame. He looked up as she entered, and she saw he already knew. "They've dismissed me," she said simply. "Yes." "How did you know?" Running Bear gestured toward the window. "Sound carries on cold air. I heard the meeting from here." He paused, studying her face. "You could have saved your position by abandoning me." "Could I have?" "You tell me." Clara set down her medical bag and looked around the small room that had become so familiar. "Number, I couldn't." Running Bear stood, steadier than she'd seen him since the first night. "Then you are ready." "Ready for what?" "To receive my name." The courthouse clock struck 10 as Clara stood before Judge Hartwell's bench, the entire population of Millerville crowded into the small courtroom. Running Bear stood beside her, no longer the dying man she'd nursed, but a figure of quiet dignity in his traditional clothes-beaded shirt, leggings, and the sacred headband his son had brought from the reservation. Agent Morrison sat in the front row, his face red with indignation. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The prisoner—" "He is not a prisoner," Judge Hartwell interrupted. "Chief Running Bear was never formally charged with any crime. He was brought here for medical care, which Miss Henley has admirably provided. But the adoption ceremony, it's not legal under territorial law. Actually, it is. The judge's voice carried the authority of 20 years on the bench. The Treaty of 1868 specifically allows for adoption between tribal members and citizens, provided it follows proper tribal protocols. Clara felt Running Bear's hand rest lightly on her shoulder. Around them, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations and shifting bodies. She could see Mrs. Morrison whispering furiously to her husband, Mayor Kellerman looking confused, her former students pressing their faces against the windows. "The ceremony is simple," Running Bear said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I give Clara Henley my name, and she becomes my daughter in the eyes of my people. With that adoption comes all rights and protections of tribal membership." Agent Morrison shot to his feet. "She's white." "Color of skin does not determine color of heart," Running Bear replied calmly. "My grandmother taught me this. Clara Henley honored that teaching when she chose healing over comfort, courage over safety." Judge Hartwell nodded to Clara. "Miss Henley, do you accept this adoption?" Clara looked out at the crowd people who had rejected her kindness as inappropriate, who had valued their prejudices over her service. Then she looked at Running Bear, who offered not just his name but his place in a larger story. "I do." Running Bear removed his beaded headband and placed it gently on Clara's head. The beadwork caught the morning light streaming through the courthouse windows, blue and white patterns that seemed to move like water. "I name you Swift Water Woman," he said, "for you move quickly to where help is needed, and like water you find ways around obstacles that would stop others." He reached into his shirt and withdrew an official document, a deed to 40 acres of reservation land that had been granted to him in the treaty negotiations. "This is my wedding gift to you, daughter. Land to build upon, if you choose to stay among our people." Clara stared at the paper. The land grant was worth more than she'd make in 5 years of teaching. But more than that, it represented belonging a place in the world where her choices would be honored rather than questioned. Agent Morrison was on his feet again, sputtering protests, but Judge Hartwell gavelled him to silence. "The ceremony is complete and legally binding. Swiftwater Woman is now a member of the Lakota Nation with all attendant rights and privileges." The courtroom erupted in noise, some supportive, some scandalized. But through it all, Clara felt a strange peace. She thought of her students, who would now learn from someone who valued conformity over compassion. She thought of her boarding-house room, soon to be occupied by a more suitable tenant. She thought of all the small compromises she'd been making her entire adult life, trying to fit into a world that never quite wanted her. "Thank you," she whispered to Running Bear. "Thank you, daughter," he replied. As they walked from the courthouse together, Clara noticed Mary Carlson tugging on her mother's skirt, pointing at the beaded headband. "Mamma, is Miss Henley an Indian now?" Mrs. Carlson looked flustered. "That is, she is Swift-Water Woman," little Susan Harper said firmly from nearby, "and she's still going to help people who are sick, because that's what she does." Clara smiled at the child and touched the beadwork on her brow. Outside, the noon train was pulling into the depot, carrying whatever news and changes this day would bring. But for the first time in years, she felt ready for whatever came next. Running Bear, who was no longer dying, who had given away his name to save it, walked beside her toward the trading post where her medical supplies waited. There would be others who needed healing, others who lived between worlds and required someone willing to build bridges. Swift-Water Woman picked up her bag and got to work. 6 months later, on a warm August evening, Clara, who was learning to think of herself as Swift-Water Woman, stood in the doorway of her small clinic on the reservation. The building had once been a storage shed, but with help from Running Bear's extended family, she'd transformed it into a proper medical facility, serving both the Lakota community and the scattered white homesteaders, who had learned to value competent care over racial prejudice. Running Bear approached from the horse corral, moving with the strength of a man who had looked death in the face and chosen life. In his hands he carried a letter bearing the Millerville postmark. "News from your former home," he said, settling into the wooden chair beside her door. Clara opened the envelope and read silently. When she finished, she looked up at the evening stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "What does it say?" Running Bear asked. The new teacher lasted 3 weeks. Apparently young Tommy Morrison asked too many questions about why Jesus healed lepers, but Christians wouldn't help Indians. Clara folded the letter with a soft laugh. "They're asking if I would consider returning." "And will you?" Clara looked around at the reservation, the scattered cabins, the community garden she'd helped plant, the children who ran to greet her when she made her rounds. Tomorrow she would deliver the Hoffman baby, tend to old Samuel's infected wound, and teach 3 Lakota women how to prepare willow bark tea. It was good work, needed work, work that mattered. "This is my home now," she said simply. Running Bear nodded, unsurprised. "Names have power, daughter. When you accepted mine, you accepted everything that came with it, including a stubborn old chief who gives away his property to make a point. Especially that." He stood, preparing to head back to his own cabin. "The clinic looks good. Your husband would be proud." Clara touched the beaded headband she now wore daily, a visible sign of the choice she'd made and the life she'd claimed. "He would have liked you, I think. He always said healing had no color. Wise man." As Running Bear walked away, Clara remained in her doorway, listening to the evening sounds of the reservation horses moving in the corral, children's laughter, the distant sound of drums from someone's celebration. It was different from the ordered quiet of Millerville, but it felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever lived. Inside her clinic, her medical supplies waited for tomorrow's patients. On her desk, the deed to her 40 acres lay next to letters from 3 other reservations asking if she would consider expanding her practice. There was good work to be done, bridges to be built, healing to be offered without question or condition. Swiftwater Woman smiled and closed her door against the night. "If you'd like more stories like this, stay a while. I'll tell the next one tomorrow night."